The first impression of goals really doesn't help much, and I completely understand anyone who entered the game, played 2 or 3 matches, and left with the feeling that something is wrong. The game presents an initial awkwardness, especially in movement and the rhythm of plays, which don't exactly follow what we are used to in other soccer games. And nowadays, with so many options and little time, many people decide right there whether it's worth continuing or not. But there is an important detail. Goals is clearly not a game that reveals itself in the first few minutes. It has a rawer, more manual style, and this takes a toll on the first impression. Many people enter expecting something more polished or automatic, and when they realize they need to relearn certain habits, they simply give up. It is the type of game that does not try to please you right away, and for many, that is already a problem. Now, when you get past this initial barrier and start to better understand how the game works, the experience changes. Positioning, passing timing, reading the plays, everything starts to make more sense. It's not that the game turns into something completely different, but it begins to click in a way that doesn't happen in the first matches. And then you realize that that initial awkwardness was, in fact, a lack of adaptation. So the interesting question remains, is goals actually bad, or is it just not friendly to new players? Because honestly, it seems much more like a case of a game that requires more patience than the public is willing to have today. And that changes quite a bit how we view these negative reviews. This is a point that weighs heavily. Expectation. Since the moment Goals was announced, many people started treating the game as if it were a new FIFA, or at the very least, a direct competitor to EA Sports FC. And this sets the bar extremely high because the public is not just evaluating the game, they're comparing it with a franchise that has dominated the genre for years, with a huge budget and an absurd level of polish. The problem is that Goals clearly does not try to be that, at least not right now. It has a different proposal, more focused on a competitive experience, rawer, and less guided by overproduced animations. But when the player enters expecting that traditional standard, full of licenses, robust modes, and familiar gameplay, the shock is inevitable. And so the frustration comes more from the broken expectation than necessarily from the actual quality of the game. And this becomes very clear in the negative reviews. You see a lot of criticism that deep down is not about what Goals does, but about what it doesn't do. There is no career mode, no license, it lacks this, it lacks that. But was that really the game's proposal? Or did we just assume it would be because that's how the soccer market works today? In the end, I feel that Goals is being judged more for the game people wanted it to be than for what it actually is at this moment. And this is dangerous because it can kill the chance for a different game to grow. I'm not saying it doesn't have problems, it has several, but perhaps the right conversation isn't, is it worse than FIFA? But rather, what is it trying to do and does that work? What strikes me most about the negative reviews of Goals is that not every criticism seems to come from the same place. Part of the public is genuinely frustrated with technical problems, but another part seems to have created an expectation of an almost perfect soccer game right at launch. And when that doesn't happen, the reaction tends to be much harsher than it should be. So before calling the game a disaster, I think it's important to separate what is legitimate disappointment from what is simply anxiety for something that has not yet delivered everything it promised. Now, when we look at the technical problems, that is where the criticisms start to make more sense. In games like this, any stutter, visual bug, strange animation, or inconsistent controller response weighs much more than in other genres, because soccer depends on fluidity at all times. If the game fails just when you need precision, the frustration becomes instantaneous. And honestly, in this type of experience, an unresolved technical detail completely changes the perception of the game. But I also think that not everything boils down to performance. A portion of the negative reviews likely comes from the feeling of a lack of content or depth. When a game arrives with a leaner proposal, without so many options, modes, or variety, many people interpret this as an incomplete game, even if the idea is to bet more on the core gameplay. And in soccer, this weighs even more because the public tends to expect a quantity of modes, progression, and longevity, not just one good isolated match. What I find most interesting about Goals is precisely trying to separate the exaggeration from valid criticism. If the game truly has gameplay flaws, bugs, or little content, that deserves to be pointed out without a filter. But there's also a huge difference between a game being problematic and a game being destroyed by unrealistic expectations or the desire to condemn everything at launch. And that is where my opinion comes in. Perhaps Goals is not being judged only for what it is, but for what many people wanted it to be. Goals really has its own identity, and that is exactly what many people ignore in the midst of the criticism. It does not try to copy EA Sports FC, nor imitate the old FIFA. In fact, it purposely moves away from this traditional model. Instead of depending on licenses, overproduced animations, and huge career modes, Goals bets on a more arcade experience focused on pure skill and controller responsiveness. What it does differently is put gameplay at the center of everything. Each pass, tackle, and shot was designed to have a more direct feeling, where the player's intention is what really matters. The physics are customized, and the AI was made to keep the game flowing without scripted moments or artificial balancing. This creates a raw, but also more honest experience within what the game proposes. Another thing that makes it clear that Goals has its own identity is the unique player system. Each athlete is truly unique. There are no clones, and your squad evolves over time, reaches its peak, and eventually retires, creating a living ecosystem that traditional licensed games cannot offer. This, along with club progression and the structure ready for esports, gives the game a much more competitive and social feel than the genre standard. Goals is not a disguised copy, it is a work that attempts to be different on purpose. The problem is that many people do not want to, or are not willing to, see this in the midst of broken expectations. It has flaws, of course, but it also has unique characteristics that place it as something truly new in the soccer genre, not as an alternative FIFA, but as a competitive experience focused on skill and community. When we talk about the gameplay of Goals, the first thing that comes to mind is it really bad or just different from what we are used to? Many soccer games follow a very defined standard. Slow movements, emphasis on simulation, heavy animations, everything very close to what FIFA and eFootball do. Goals, on the other hand, seems to bet on something faster, more dynamic, and with a more arcade approach. And when a game deviates from this standard, it is very common for the first reaction to be rejection, even before we understand its proposal. The problem is that there's a huge difference between not liking something and considering something to be poorly made. I have seen several players saying the gameplay is bad just because it doesn't feel like traditional games. But if the mechanics work consistently, if the responses are predictable, and if the game offers a real challenge based on those mechanics, then you can't say it is poorly made. It may just be that it is not the type of experience you are looking for. And that is something completely legitimate, but it does not justify classifying the game as bad just for not following the standard. This happens a lot with games that try to innovate in the soccer genre. When the gameplay changes, the player needs time to adapt, to understand the rhythms, the passing times, the shooting moment, the way the defense behaves. Without this adaptation period, it is very easy to go around saying that you can't control it, that the game doesn't respond right, when in fact the response is just different from what we expect. I believe that Goals asks for exactly this: a learning period, an openness to experiment without directly comparing it to what already exists in the market. I think it is important to reflect. When we say that the gameplay of Goals is bad, are we talking about something really poorly constructed or just something that doesn't match our expectation? I didn't like it is a valid opinion, but it is poorly made is a technical statement that needs a basis. And honestly, before totally condemning the game, perhaps it is worth giving it a chance to understand its proposal, playing without the weight of FIFA or the big competitors, and seeing if, over time, this different gameplay doesn't end up becoming something interesting, or at least fair to be judged. We need to consider the possibility that we are seeing the birth of something promising, even if everything seems so chaotic today. The history of soccer games is full of titles that started out problematic and, over time, became references. The very FIFA of the 90s was extremely limited compared to what would come later, and even the first EA Sports FC was still looking for its place in the world after the separation from the FIFA brand. Goals strongly recalls those moments when a game arrives with interesting ideas, but still without the necessary maturity. The gameplay has a solid foundation, the idea of each player being unique, and the focus on pure competition show that there is a clear vision behind the project. What is missing today, polish, balance, adjustments, more content, can very well be solved with patches and updates, as happened with several other games that we now consider classics. What worries me is that the modern public no longer has the patience for this type of game in development. Everyone wants the final product right at launch, and when that doesn't happen, the reception is brutal. But is it fair to condemn a game for not being ready on day one when it clearly has the potential to become much better? EA Sports, FC, eFootball, even FIFA itself, they all had problematic launches and improved over time. The evolution potential of goals may be much more important than its current state. If the developers manage to keep the pace of updates, listen to the community, and adjust the points that bother most, this game can truly grow. And a year from now, it is possible that we will be talking about it in a completely different way. Not as a failure, but as a game that had the courage to start. When we think about goals, it is impossible not to return to the most basic question. Even with all the defects the game has, does it manage to be fun? Because, deep down, this is the main goal of any game. Not to be perfect, nor technological, nor the most faithful to reality. What matters is if, when you pick up the controller and start to play, you feel that pleasure of doing something that engages you, challenges you, and brings you satisfaction. And honestly, even with the criticism, Goals still manages to deliver moments of real fun. Soccer as a genre is one of the most sensitive to this. If the game doesn't give you that thrill of taking a shot at the right time, of cutting a pass, of seeing the ball hitting the net, it loses its meaning. And Goals, despite everything, has moments when this happens. The faster, more arcade gameplay creates situations that are different from traditional games, but which still bring that charge of emotion. You might get stuck on some bugs, get frustrated with the AI, but the moment you score a nice goal, the feeling is the same as any other soccer game you have ever loved. Now, what I find interesting is that the fun doesn't need to come from a perfect game. It can come from a game that has flaws, but that still manages to hook you. Goals has problems, but it also has that feeling of response that makes you want to try again. Oh, I'm going to take that shot again. I'm going to try to cut that pass. I'm going to do that counterattack. And that is what keeps the player coming back. It's not just technical quality, it's the game's ability to make you feel like you are participating in something that, even with defects, still brings you pleasure. I think what matters most in Goals is this fun factor. If, even with all the problems, the game still manages to make you feel that emotion of playing soccer, then it is already doing what it needs to. It may not be the best soccer game on the market, it may have bugs, weak AI, lack of content, but if it hooked you, challenged you, and made you feel pleasure in playing, it has already fulfilled its main objective. And honestly, that is what I think many people are forgetting when they condemn the game entirely. The fun still exists, even with the defects. Sometimes the problem is not the game itself, but the lack of content we expect in it. Goals has a gameplay base that, in practice, works. The movement is responsive, the passes have weight, and the sense of control is direct. But when you enter and see that there are no game modes, licenses, real teams, or even a campaign, the frustration hits quickly. And this is not just an impression. Many people judge the game by what is missing, not by what it delivers. The point is that the foundation of the project seems solid. The physical engine, the basic AI, and the core gameplay show that there is a well-built base behind it. The problem is that this base is still empty of content. There is no career mode, no licensed teams, no mess of options that we are used to in the big games. And this makes it seem poor even when the title has potential. What strikes me is that even with all this missing, you can feel that the core of the game is promising. When you play an online match, the sense of competition is real, and the gameplay has a weight that makes sense. This is not something that is created at the last minute. It is a sign that the developers focused first on the foundation and left the content for later. And this, in theory, is an intelligent strategy. So the question that remains is the problem the game or just its moment? Because if the base is really as good as it seems, you can fix all of this with updates, career mode, teams, licenses, more options. All of this can arrive later. The hard part is convincing the public to wait. since we are used to receiving the complete product at launch. Is it worth following goals in 2026? It is a question that many people avoid answering, but one that I think is essential for those who want to understand the game without the weight of immediate criticism. Goals arrived with problems, with negative reviews, and with extremely high expectations. But what really matters is what will happen from here on out. Games like this are not judged only by their launch. They are judged by what is built afterward. And Goals has a real opportunity to grow. If the developer understands that the game needs time, adjustments, and a community that wants to see it evolve. The update model is one of the most important points for this. If the developers continue working on the game, rushing to fix bugs, adjusting the AI, improving the gameplay, and adding new content, the game can completely change the perception the public has of it. I have already seen several soccer games that started with harsh criticism, but which, with constant updates, became much more solid experiences. Goals could be one of those cases if the team maintains the pace of adjustments and does not get discouraged after the first criticisms. The future of the game depends a lot on this. But updates are not just what the developers do, it is also what the community does. If there is a community sufficient to sustain growth, the game gains a life of its own. Goals has a community, even if it is still small, and that is good. Players who are returning, who are testing, who are giving feedback, who are creating content, who are helping the game to evolve. And if this community grows, if it remains active, the game gains strength. It is not just about having players, it is about having people who want to see the game grow, who want it to be better. In the end, I think it is worth following Goals in 2026, but with one condition. If you are open to seeing the game evolve, if you are willing to give it time, if you don't just want to condemn it, but want to help, if you want to see if the game can become something more. Goals may not be the best soccer game on the market right now, but it may be a game that grows, that adjusts, that becomes something interesting. And then, depending on the path the developer chooses, Goals could be a success story, not of launch, but of evolution. And that is what I think matters most. The final verdict is complicated because Goals really does not deserve this reputation of being a bad game without reservations. It has real problems, lack of content, insufficient polish, broken expectations, but it also has a solid base, solid gameplay, and a clear proposal to be different. What we see today is more of an incomplete project being judged as if it were the final product. If we look only at what is available right now, you can understand the frustration. Career mode, licensed teams, varied modes, all of this is missing, and that weighs heavily. But when you focus on what the game actually delivers, fast matches, responsive gameplay, focus on skill and competition, things change. The foundation is good, and that is rare to see in soccer games at launch. I think the biggest problem is the timing. Goals arrived with high expectations compared to EA Sports FC, and with a public without patience for games that are still being built. And so it was condemned before it had a chance to grow. It is not that it is perfect, but it is unfair to treat it as a total failure when it clearly has the potential to evolve a lot. My opinion is that Goals is not a bad game. It is an incomplete game with a promising base. It deserves to be judged with more nuance, not just by the negative criticisms of the launch. If the developers continue working, it is quite possible that in a few months we will be talking about it in a totally different way, as a project that was worth the wait.
And when I feel like this, I'm immortal. When I feel like this, I'm